All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This is part 4, the conclusion of our 4-part series, Family Jewels, where we are looking back at the Church Committee revelations, then the hearings and the report from 75-76. This exposed lots of covert activity by the NSA, FBI, and CIA. First episode was about meddling abroad. Second episode was about meddling at home. Third episode was about meddling in people's minds. And this one is about meddling in the press, and also a chance to kind of talk about the press and how this was covered and kind of what came of all these revelations. So back to do that, as always, Nicole Hammer of Columbia and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And Rick Perlstein is back for one final episode, author of Before the Storm, Nixonland, The Invisible Bridge, Reaganland. But thank you, Rick, for doing this.
My pleasure.
All right. So, meddling in the press. One thing I'll point out, there was a Operation Mockingbird and a Project Mockingbird. And, so as clever as these people are sometimes, they also just couldn't come up with two different names for two slightly related but also slightly different programs. But the Mockingbirds were largely about kind of spying on journalists and also putting propaganda out there. Nikki, is there anything from these revelations and what came out in the Church Committee hearings about the relationship with the press, with the intelligence community's relationship with the press that jumps out at you?
Sure. I mean, there were certainly stories of the intelligence community cultivating journalists, but they were also spying on them. And this shouldn't come as a huge surprise because so many of these big revelations are reported. They're broken, not by the Church Committee, but by journalists. And so you have the surveillance of investigative journalist Jack Anderson and all of his different associates, including a very young Brit Hume, who would later go on to join Fox News, Michael Geltler at the Washington Post, syndicated columnist Robert Allen and Paul Scott. So you have all of these people who are writing, and the CIA and the FBI are investigating them, are tapping them, and trying to figure out sometimes who their sources are, sometimes trying to find embarrassing information on them. But they're trying to both plug up all of the leaks and also discredit the journalist involved.
I will say that to me, this is most disturbing because the journalist community is charged with bringing the public the truth. And so if there is an element of that feels like it is being tampered with or censored or threatened, then it really undermines all of the public trust, because how is the public to know, are you tampering this down? Are you exaggerating, or are you playing this up or playing this down? And I think, again, there's so much resonance with today, but like how people have a trust in what information is being given to them is a huge deal. And I think this element to me is I don't know if it's more damaging, but I would say equally important as all the other, previous episodes that we've talked about, because it's the one that has the most lasting effect to me, like how we grapple with information and how information is being given to us and whether or not there's veracity to it. And whether or not journalists feel empowered and protected to say what they need to write, to report on what's worthy of reporting, is big.
I mean, isn't it the case that maybe the executives or the editors were complicit with some of this stuff?
Yeah.
Yep. There were times that they were.
Yeah.
And it's what's so fascinating about it is that there's a kind of almost elite consensus that this is something that the government should be doing. And it's the reporters and ordinary Americans who are surprised by it and shocked by it. And I think that one of the reasons this is so damaging in a way is, when it came to domestic surveillance, sometimes the targets weren't that sympathetic, but Americans have a pretty strong sense of freedom of the press as a kind of sacrosanct right. You're in this period where journalists are being lionized for their investigative reporting. And it's also signaling to journalists that they are, in a way, at war with the government, at least a handful of journalists. And it just kind of stiffens their spines in a way at a moment when there are a lot of professional upsides to investigating the government.
Yeah, I mean, isn't it kind of like a literal violation of the First Amendment? I mean, Congress shall make no law, restricting freedom of the press. And here's, at least, unfortunately, the problem was Congress kind of wasn't making the laws. All these budgets and activities were secret, but they were the ones who were authorizing this money, and they were using it to, sabotage journalism. And like Kelly says, causing the distrust of yet one more institution, which is, the pillar institution of a free people. And, my contribution to this is that I think ultimately the media, the elite parts of the media I'm talking about, did a really poor job of kind of defending themselves, right? And almost like kind of surrendered in the face of some of this stuff. I mean, once the CIA kind of got its footing again and realized that it had kind of an opening to push back about this stuff, it was around, the leaking of the name of a CIA agent by, Philip Agee, the whistleblowing agent who published in a magazine a list of several CIA agents. And he said, and the station chief is this guy named Richard Welch in Lima, Peru. Well, just so happens that he wasn't in Lima, Peru. He was in Athens, Greece, and coincidentally was assassinated because they knew it was the CIA station chief. Completely had nothing to do with it. The CIA kind of weaponized that coincidence to say this is what's going to happen if any of these more revelations came out. And just kind of, again, coincidentally, the House investigation run by this guy, Otis Pike, was about to be released. And in a lot of ways, that report was even more devastating. One of the reasons it was so devastating is it had a lot more about kind of the mistakes of the CIA, saying that the 6-Day War was going to be, a long war, saying there wasn't going to be a war in the Middle East in the fall of 1973, but also like how the CIA was paying $800,000 to a fascist general, just all kinds of stuff that the CIA just didn't want known, because a lot of what security institutions do when they're about to be called on their incompetence is raise the issue of, security.
Yes.
Right? They'll say, you're going to harm our sources and methods when really they just don't want to be embarrassed. And that's exactly what happened. And so Congress voted not to publish the Pike report. They voted to suppress it. And Daniel Shore, who's one of the heroes of this story, since people who are of my generation will remember him on NPR, said, no, this has to come out. And so he had a copy of it and he turned it over to the Village Voice. And the Village Voice published it through the intermediary of this not-for-profit group to which Daniel Shore gave basically a donation to help them with the expenses. And that became the issue in the New York Times. Like the New York Times ran editorials about how Daniel Shore was paying for journalism. And, so kind of like, it's the leak of the Supreme Court's, Roe versus Wade decision. That's the problem. It's a decision itself. So, the elite media kind of bogged themselves down in all these questions of process when they should have been talking about how, their basic institutional raison d'etre, which is, informing the public of the doings of the government in the people's name, is being sabotaged.
Yeah.
That was a pattern throughout this process. So, there's active sabotaging, as we've described, and then there's this larger kind of soft power nexus between press and the government. And, I will say, I think a lot of times when people use the talk about the swamp, I don't think they actually know what they're saying, but I actually, on their behalf, think what they're talking about is probably this idea that the press and the government are, cozy, and they're at the same cocktail parties, and they often are. And so, I'm curious, like, the picture that's painted as the Church Committee revelations come out, not just with the press, but with all this other stuff. Is it really painting a picture of specific operations, or is it just painting a picture of a coziness and a kind of way that softer power to build consensus works, and which one is kind of more with the perspective of time, which one feels like the bigger revelation?
That's really well said, right? I mean, you get into these weird realms in which kind of basically this abstraction called power is really just defending itself and guarding its own reproduction, and talking about how, if there is a culture of accountability, who knows what they're going to put in their sights next.
Yeah, I think it's easier for people to wrap their minds around those connections, Jody, that get revealed about, like, the CIA is paying prominent writers, people like Arthur Schlesinger, to continue to write against the Soviet Union and things like that, because that itself seems like such concrete evidence of something someone shouldn't be doing. But when it comes to the cocktail parties, when it comes to the idea that these folks are all...
Our kids go to kindergarten together.
Yeah.
That's something that's... It's almost more insidious and more damaging to trust in those institutions, but it's much more difficult to convey as something that is scandalous.
It's scandalous, and it's also, if it is discussed in the public realm, it's often as an unmitigated good. That back in the days before the era of suspicion, Republicans and Democrats had scotch together. Journalists and reporters, went to parties together.
That's the correspondence dinner. You know what I mean?
Correspondence dinner,
you have this correspondence dinner in which everyone's in a room schmoozing and yucking it up. And it really does blur the line about politics and journalism and truth telling and these really questionable relationships. It's a problem.
If a president, when they're doing their sort of safe but slightly edgy jokes at the correspondence dinner, man, imagine if a president was like, "Oh, by the way, here's the file I have on you. I pulled your file." Right? I mean,
that's kind of right. Well, I mean, I think there was kind of like this strange correspondence dinner example of that when Barack Obama was doing his little comedy routine, while they were offing Osama bin Laden.
I know,
right?
Yeah,
which could have turned out terribly. We never would have heard about it, right?
Yeah. All right. I do want to start to wrap up here, and this series has been fantastic, and there's so much more, and someone, maybe us, should do a big, deeper podcast dive or something. But
wait, Jody, can I ask a question?
Yes, I want. Yeah, I want to get some thoughts and
after
ideas
this series. Are we all going to get FBI files?
Maybe.
As if you don't already have one, Kelly.
I just want to know if we put ourselves in harm's way.
We'll see. Yeah, and then we'll have.
Well, I mean, there was an outcome, right? There was a policy outcome. They created, these bipartisan overseeing committees that looked into the budgets a little more thoroughly than had been before. Unfortunately, under Trump, when Devin Nunes took over the horn in the House, it became, a vector, for Trump's, Democratic backsliding. But I think for, a short period, there was a little bit of kind of got harder. Jimmy Carter hacked back the budget and the personnel for the skullduggery. Then he undid it after Afghanistan. And then, of course, next thing you know, William Casey is the head of the CIA, and he's, sending, cakes to the Ayatollah and all that stuff. So there was this brief window of accountability.
Ford issued an executive order banning political assassinations, which is like, if you have to issue the executive order, it's like, it has been 0 days since the U.S. Like, well, why are you even keeping count?
Why are you making the sign, man?
Yeah, exactly.
But I also, I did a deep dive into this a few years ago for Vox about this moment of transparency and accountability and all of these reforms that are put in place and the remarkable way in which they stay in place, and yet they weaken so much in the years that follow, where you have things like the FISA court becomes a rubber stamp. FOIA requests are constantly blocked or take years, decades to actually fulfill. And so you still have these mechanisms in place, but their actual functioning no longer serves to be these tools of transparency that they were imagined to be in the 1970s.
Yeah, people have figured out kind of how to game them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is why, you constantly have to kind of rewater, this kind of garden.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, Barack Obama came along and there was all kinds of intelligence abuses. And he said, in between the period of his election and his inauguration that, it wasn't time to look backward.
Yeah.
So
a
lot of this, kind of culture of elite non-accountability comes out of that moment of discomfort that, once we open Pandora's box, we can't close it again.
Yeah.
And here we are.
Well, we often end our depressing
I was about to say,
ending there.
Lift us back up, Jody.
I know, yeah. But look, no, I mean, this has been, incredibly fascinating, and I think there's so much more out there. And so I'll just implore listeners, like, go read up on this stuff. And if there's any tidbit that we missed or any big thought you have, get in touch, because we will certainly keep circling around on these.
The real go-to book on this is wonderful historian named Catherine Olmsted, and she did a book called Investigating the Secret Government. Great. Not a long book, but it's got it all in there.
Great. Okay. I think we should leave it there. And I think we can also leave it with Rick, who I don't know who it was that you name checked, but who talked about not the kind of truth we need right now. Well, hopefully this was a little bit of the kind of truth we need right now.
There you
this
go.
Stuff is so resonant. So yes. Well, Rick Perlstein, thank you so much for joining us for this series. This was super interesting.
Cheers. Look forward to hearing it, guys.
Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day in Esoteric Political History is a proud member of Radiotopia from PRX, a network of independent, listener-supported, artist-owned podcasts. We can only make the show with your support. If you want to support the show and the network, you can do it at thisdaypod.org. Also on our website, you can sign up for our newsletter. You can also see transcripts of the show. Our researcher and producer is Jacob Feldman. Our producer is Brittany Brown. Kala Nakua helps with transcripts and the newsletter. Thanks to Julie Shapiro and Audrey Martovich, executive producers at Radiotopia. Thanks to the whole team at Radiotopia and PRX. If you have any questions or comments or ideas about the show, get in touch, thisdaypod@gmail.com, or find us on social media at thisdaypod. My name is Jody Avergan. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you soon.
Radiotopia.